Everyone's talking about artificial intelligence as if it's the next big revolution that will transform everything. Billions of dollars are being poured into AI companies. Valuations are reaching stratospheric levels. Every startup adds AI to its name and magically multiplies its value. CEOs promise that AI will solve all problems. Investors fight over pieces of anything related to machine learning. The media relentlessly publishes stories about how AI is the future. And amidst all this euphoria, all this delirious hype, almost no one is stating the obvious truth. We are in the middle of a massive speculative bubble, and when it bursts, and it will burst, the damage will be apocalyptic. But here's the truly terrifying part that no one is discussing. Even when the bubble bursts, even when trillions in paper value evaporate, even when half of the AI startups fail overnight, your profession will still disappear. Because the real technology behind the hype is genuine, and once it exists, it doesn't disappear. And what comes after the explosion, the next chapter of this story, is far darker than anything we're seeing now. Let's start by understanding what a bubble really is and why we are undoubtedly in one now. Bubbles happen when asset prices become completely disconnected from any rational basis, when speculation and euphoria replace sober analysis of real value. We saw this with tulips in Holland in the 17th century. We saw it with railroad stocks in the 19th century. We saw it with the dot-com bubble in the late 90s. We saw it with real estate in 2008. And now we are seeing it with AI. Companies that have little more than a language model and a PowerPoint presentation receive valuations in the billions. Tech giants spend tens of billions building data centers for AI without a clear business model of how this will generate returns. Investors throw money at anything with artificial intelligence in the name, without asking the hard questions about real revenue, real profit, real sustainability. The parallels with the dot-com bubble are frightening. Back then, all you had to do was add a dot-com to your company name and the stock value would skyrocket. Now it's the same thing with AI, and just like the dot-com bubble, this bubble will burst. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. It could be in 6 months, it could be in 2 years, but it will happen. And when it does, it will be brutal. Companies valued in the billions will disappear completely. Investors will lose fortunes. Tech stocks will plummet. Startups will fail by the thousands. Tech jobs will evaporate. It will be 2000 all over again, only possibly worse because the scale of investment is much larger. Trillions of dollars in market value will simply evaporate. Pension funds that have invested heavily in technology will suffer massive losses. Retirement savings will be destroyed. There will be shockwaves throughout the global economy. But here's what makes this bubble fundamentally different from previous ones. The underlying technology is real. When the dot-com bubble burst, many of the internet's promises were genuine but premature. The technology wasn't there yet. The infrastructure didn't exist. The business models didn't make sense. With AI, the technology not only exists, it's already working, already being implemented, already replacing human labor. The problem isn't that the promises are false. The problem is that they're being hyperinflated to justify insane valuations. But the real technical capability exists and will continue to exist after the bubble bursts. So what happens to your profession when the bubble bursts? You might think, if the bubble bursts, if AI companies fail, if investment dries up, maybe that will slow down automation, maybe that will give me more time. That thinking is completely wrong. The bursting of the bubble will actually accelerate the process of job elimination, not slow it down. Let me explain why. During a bubble, there's a lot of easy money flying around. Companies can be inefficient. They can waste resources. They can hire more people than they need. When the bubble bursts, when money gets tight, when survival becomes an urgent matter, companies are forced to cut everything that isn't essential. And guess what isn't essential? Human workers who can be replaced by automation. In fact, the economic crisis caused by the bursting of the bubble will create massive pressure to automate faster. Companies struggling to survive will look for any way to cut costs. Human wages are generally the biggest operating cost, so the first thing they do is look for ways to replace people with technology. And unlike previous bubbles, where replacement technology was still being developed, this time it already exists, it's ready. It's already been tested. Companies that survive the bursting will be those that have automated most aggressively. This creates competitive pressure for all companies to do the same. So paradoxically, the bursting of the bubble accelerates exactly the process that everyone fears. And there's more. During the bubble, there was intense competition for AI talent. Machine learning engineers earned absurd salaries. Companies fought over people with expertise. This kept AI implementation costs relatively high. When the bubble bursts, when thousands of AI engineers are unemployed, when competition for talent evaporates, the cost of implementing AI solutions will plummet. Tools will become cheaper, services will become more accessible. Small and medium-sized enterprises that couldn't afford to automate during the bubble suddenly will be able to. So the democratization of AI, which sounds great in theory, in practice means that many more jobs in many more places will be eliminated much faster. Now let's move on to the next chapter, the part that's truly frightening. What happens after the bubble bursts, after the economy goes into crisis, after automation accelerates, after millions lose their jobs? We're talking about a toxic combination of massive financial crisis, unprecedented structural unemployment, and technology that continues to eliminate jobs faster than new ones are created. It's a perfect storm that could destroy the very fabric of modern society. The first consequence is a collapse of confidence in markets and institutions. The dot-com bubble already shook confidence. The 2008 financial crisis shook it even more. But this time, when people see that it's not just a problem of financial speculation, that the very nature of work is being eliminated, that there's no way back to the economy that existed before, confidence can be completely destroyed. When you lose faith that the system works, that there is a possible future within the existing structures, behavior changes in fundamental and dangerous ways. People stop saving because they see no point. They stop planning for the long term because there is no certainty. They stop following rules because rules no longer seem to serve any purpose. It's a recipe for social collapse. The second consequence is what I call the reverse domino effect. Normally when a bubble bursts, there's a period of pain, then gradual recovery. But this time the recovery never truly comes because the jobs that were lost don't return. They've been automated. So you have all the pain of a financial crash without the eventual hope of recovery. This means prolonged pain that turns into chronic despair, and large-scale chronic despair leads to very bad things: revolutions, civil wars, government collapse. The rise of authoritarian regimes promising order and security in exchange for freedom. History shows this repeatedly. When economic conditions get bad enough for long enough, political structures that seem stable crumble. The third consequence is the total fragmentation of society into essentially permanent castes. You will have a small elite that controls technology, possesses skills rare enough to remain economically valuable, and lives in abundance. And you will have a massive mass of people permanently unemployed, without prospects, without hope. But unlike previous periods of high inequality, this time mobility between these classes will be almost impossible, because what determines your class is not just education or effort, but having specific skills that AI cannot replicate, and the number of these skills is constantly shrinking. It's digital feudalism, where your birth and initial circumstances determine your destiny almost absolutely. The fourth consequence is that the very social support systems that could cushion the impact will collapse. Unemployment insurance was designed for temporary unemployment, not permanent displacement of labor. Welfare systems can handle a few percent of the population needing help, not 40 or 50%. And when the bubble bursts, government revenues will plummet precisely when demand for services explodes. Governments will be in an unprecedented fiscal crisis, forced to choose between cutting services when they are most needed or incurring unsustainable debt that leads to sovereign crises. Many will try to print money, leading to inflation or hyperinflation that destroys savings and creates further chaos. The fifth consequence is the complete loss of purpose and meaning for billions of people. Work is not just a source of income, it's identity, structure, community, purpose. When you remove that without replacing it with something equivalent, you create an existential vacuum. And large-scale existential vacuums are filled with bad things. Chemical dependency explodes. Suicides skyrocket. Cults and extremist ideologies proliferate. Violence increases. All the worst aspects of human nature emerge when hope disappears. And we're not talking about a few percent of the population. We're talking about a scale we've never faced before. The sixth consequence is the collapse of entire industries that depend on consumers having discretionary income. Entertainment, tourism, hospitality, retail, all enter a death spiral. This creates more unemployment, which creates less consumption, which creates more bankruptcies in a self-perpetuating vicious cycle. Entire cities that depended economically on these industries can become deserted. Detroit at its worst, multiplied by hundreds of cities around the world. The seventh consequence is that education, which traditionally was a path to social mobility, completely loses its purpose and value. Why spend years studying when there are no jobs waiting? Why accumulate student debt for worthless qualifications? The entire education system enters an existential crisis. Universities begin to close. Teachers lose their jobs en masse. An entire generation can grow up without adequate education, creating a human capital deficit that persists for decades and ensures that recovery, even if possible, will be slow and painful. The eighth consequence is geopolitical instability on a terrifying scale. Countries facing deep domestic crises have an incentive to create external enemies. Resources become more contested. Old conflicts resurface with new urgency. And this time, conflicts may involve not only conventional weapons, but cyber warfare on a massive scale, sabotage of critical infrastructure, even autonomous weapons and other technologies that make war more destructive than ever. The risk of conflict between major powers, including nuclear powers, increases dramatically. And in the chaos, small regional wars can proliferate without anyone having the capacity or will to intervene. The ninth consequence is that the environment suffers collaterally. When societies are in survival mode, when resources are desperately scarce, long-term concerns like climate change are luxuries that no one can afford to prioritize. Environmental regulations are abandoned, resources are exploited without regard for sustainability. And ironically, social chaos makes it impossible to implement precisely the technological solutions that could help with environmental problems because they require sustained investment and international cooperation that no longer exist. The 10th consequence is the loss of knowledge and scientific capacity. Cutting-edge research requires stability, resources, and collaboration. When all of this is in crisis, when scientists are unemployed, when universities are closing, when funding has disappeared, scientific progress can not only stop, but reverse. Knowledge can be lost, infrastructure can deteriorate, and advances that could eventually help solve problems simply don't happen because the capacity to do science has been destroyed. The 11th consequence is that public health enters a dark age. Overburdened and underfunded health systems are unable to cope with basic needs, much less invest in research and development. Diseases that we thought were under control may resurface. New pandemics find populations unable to respond adequately. Life expectancy may begin to fall. Infant mortality may increase. All the gains in public health of the last few decades could be reversed in years. The 12th consequence is cultural fragmentation and the loss of shared values. When society is divided into castes, when life experiences become so different, when there is no longer a common narrative or shared destiny, culture fragments. Different groups essentially live in different realities. Communication between groups becomes impossible because there is no common basis of experience or values. And cultural fragmentation makes it even more difficult to coordinate solutions to shared problems. You cannot build consensus when there is no longer a unified society. The 13th consequence is the rise of extreme religious or quasi-religious movements. When the rational world has failed, when science and technology have brought disaster instead of utopia, when traditional structures have collapsed, people seek meaning in alternative belief systems. Some will be benign, offering comfort and community. Others will be destructive, apocalyptic, violent. History shows that periods of intense social crisis often see an explosion in millenarian movements and cults. And in the age of digital communication and access to technology, these movements may have unprecedented destructive capacity. The 14th consequence is that the very physical infrastructure of civilization begins to collapse. Roads, bridges, power grids, water systems, everything requires constant maintenance. When governments are in fiscal crisis, when the priority is only to maintain basic order, infrastructure maintenance is neglected. Then, literally, the physical world around you begins to crumble. Bridges fall, roads develop enormous potholes. Water becomes unreliable, electricity experiences frequent blackouts, quality of life deteriorates in tangible daily ways. The 15th consequence is the emergence of effectively lawless zones, where the government lacks the capacity or will to impose order. You can start with neighborhoods, then entire cities, then regions. In these places, power is wielded by whoever has the strength to seize and maintain it. Gangs, militias, local warlords. And once civil order completely collapses in an area, restoring it is exponentially more difficult than maintaining it would have been. The 16th consequence is that technology, ironically, may become less accessible. Data centers require massive amounts of energy. When power grids are unstable, when energy is expensive and rationed, keeping digital infrastructure running becomes problematic. The internet may become intermittent or too expensive for most people. Technology that theoretically exists may not be available in practice. And the divide between those with access to technology and those without becomes another form of fundamental inequality. The 17th consequence is profound generational trauma. Children growing up in this environment of chaos, scarcity, violence, and hopelessness will carry psychological scars that shape their lives and are passed on to the next generation. You create intergenerational cycles of dysfunction and trauma that can take decades or centuries to heal. The damage is not just to the current generation, but to several future generations. The 18th consequence is that art and culture, things that make human life rich and meaningful beyond mere survival, practically disappear. When everyone is focused on surviving day to day, when there are no resources to support artists and thinkers, when cultural institutions close, cultural production withers. You enter a cultural dark age where humanity is so focused on survival that it loses what makes it truly human. The 19th consequence is that memory and history can be lost. When libraries close, when archives deteriorate, when there are no resources for preservation, when intergenerational transmission of knowledge is interrupted, societies literally forget their own past. And without historical memory, you are condemned to repeat mistakes because you don't remember why certain things are bad ideas. The 20th, and perhaps most frightening consequence, is the growing perception that there is no way out, that this is not a temporary crisis, but a new, permanent reality. When people lose hope that things will improve, when they accept that this is how life will be from now on, you see profound behavioral changes. People stop trying to improve the situation. They accept conditions that would have been intolerable. They teach their children to accept them as well. You create a culture of defeat and learned hopelessness that is incredibly difficult to reverse, even if objective conditions improve. So when I say the AI bubble is about to burst, I'm not being alarmist. I'm being realistic about the nature of bubbles and about obvious signs that anyone paying attention can see. When I say your profession may cease to exist, I'm not speculating about the distant future. I'm talking about a process that has already begun, and that the bubble's bursting will accelerate, not slow down. And when I say the next chapter is much scarier, I'm trying to make you understand that job loss is just the first domino. The cascading consequences that follow are the real nightmare. We are heading towards a period of social, economic, and political turbulence unparalleled in modern history. And the tragedy is that much of this could be avoided if we acted now. But we are not acting. And when the bubble bursts, it will be too late to prevent the worst outcomes. But if you've made it this far, if you've read all this and haven't closed your eyes to reality, then you're already ahead of 99% of people. Because the truth, however harsh it may be, is the only real tool we have. Ignorance may be temporarily comfortable, but it's the worst possible strategy when you're navigating a storm. So what's the moral of this story? It's not to give up. It's not to panic. It's not to accept defeat. The moral is that knowledge is power and preparation is everything. You can't stop the bubble from bursting. You can't reverse the march of automation. You can't single-handedly prevent the coming collapse. But you can control how you respond to it. You can start preparing now while there's still time, however little. You can develop skills that are harder to automate, things that require genuine creativity, deep emotional intelligence, complex critical thinking, real human connection. You can build strong networks of relationships, because when systems fail, community will be everything. You can diversify your income sources and not depend on a single job. You can save, prepare reserves, reduce debt, because financial flexibility will be critical when turbulence arrives. More importantly, you can abandon the illusion that tomorrow's world will be like today's. You can accept that radical change is coming and begin to adapt mentally and emotionally now, instead of being forced to do so in a state of crisis. You can teach your children not only specific skills, but meta-competencies, the ability to learn continuously, emotional resilience, and adaptive thinking. You can get involved politically, pushing for policies that create safety nets, that distribute the benefits of technology more equitably, that prepare society for the transition. Your individual voice may seem small, but the collective voices of informed people can make a difference. And perhaps, just perhaps, if enough people wake up to reality, if enough people stop denying and start acting, if enough people demand that leaders take the situation seriously, we can still change the trajectory. We cannot avoid the turbulence completely, but we can make it less catastrophic. We cannot preserve the world as it was, but we can influence the kind of world that emerges. We cannot guarantee that you will keep your current job, but we can work to create a society where losing your job does not mean losing dignity, hope, or the ability to live decently. Human history is full of moments where all seemed lost, where collapse seemed inevitable, but where humans found ways to survive, adapt, and eventually thrive again. We are an extraordinarily resilient and creative species, but this resilience is not automatic. It requires us to face reality with open eyes, to make difficult decisions, to act with courage and determination. It requires us to stop living in denial and start living in preparation. You've been warned. You know what's coming. The question now isn't whether you can avoid the storm, but how you'll navigate it. And that choice, that power to decide how you respond to the inevitable, no one can take that away from you. That's the only real control you have. Use it wisely. Start today. Because every day that passes without preparation is one less day you have before reality forces its hand. The future won't be easy, but it doesn't have to be the total apocalypse I painted if enough people act intelligently and urgently. And even in the worst-case scenario, those who prepared, who understood, who adapted, will have infinitely better chances than those who lived in denial until the last moment. You choose which group you'll be in. And that choice, made today, will determine not only your future, but the future of everyone who depends on you. Choose wisely.